What makes this art so good? Fire Force is criticized for a lot of things, but even its haters will agree that it has some of the best art in manga. Thanks to the talent of Atsushi Ohkubo, the creator of Soul Eater, Fire Force is one of the most visually stunning manga in the last decade. But what is it about the art style that people like so much? What is it that makes this art style stand out from other manga? In this video, I'm going to examine the defining traits of Fire Force's art style, discuss how they changed over time, and explain why Fire Force is one of the best looking manga of all time. A few disclaimers before I start. First of all, I'm only looking at the manga, so as much as I love Dave Pro, I'm not going to talk about the anime. Second, as this video will cover the entire series, be warned that there will probably be some spoilers if you haven't finished the manga. But with those out of the way, let's start talking about the art style in general. Now, a lot of times with manga, I'll think the art style changes a lot and then I'll go back and I'll be like, oh wow, that was actually pretty consistent. When I reread Black Clover, I was like, wow, this is the most consistent art style I've ever seen. When I reread My Hero Academia, I was like, oh wow, this is the most consistent art style I've ever seen. But then I read Fire Force, after reading Soul Eater, by the way. And as of right now, this is the most consistent art style I've ever seen. If you've never read Soul Eater before, the Fire Force manga basically starts off right where the Soul Eater manga ended. Aesthetically, that is. But that isn't to say they're identical. Obviously, when we're talking about the iconic look in either of these series, the thing everyone thinks of is character design. But we'll get to that in just a few minutes. The first thing anyone notices, or at least that I noticed when reading Fire Force, are the backgrounds. This is made apparent in one of the very first panels of the series. In this panel, we get the shot of the subway train, and it is loaded with detail. If you look at the tower in the very back, you can make out a little circle that implies this is a clock tower. Then as you get closer, you can see the individual panels of each window, and you can see some more intricate designs on the buildings. Then in the foreground, you get the train and the bridge, and they are loaded with detail. Especially on the bridge, you can see all the bricks, all the damage from over time, all the pipes and generators. This is only one of the first panels in the manga, and already Ohkubo packs as much detail in the scenery as he possibly can. He was already good at backgrounds in Soul Eater, but in Fire Force, it's like it's on a new level. What this does is give readers a very vivid illustration of what this world looks like, in addition to the very thorough world building he does through the plot as well. So you combine these two, and what you get is a story that you can see so precisely that it feels like you could step right in. You are so familiar with all the details of this world that very little is left to the imagination, and it feels real. This is true for buildings, tools, cars, clothes, everything in this world. And this level of detail never goes away. It comes and goes in each scene, but the detailed scenery in Fire Force is something that is always a part of the art style. And I would argue this is a deliberate choice by Ohkubo, at least partly because it helps to create contrast to these stylized characters. But before I say more on that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. So of course, more than anything, Ohkubo is known for his iconic character designs. I mean, you take Soul Eater and everyone can name at least one or two characters. And the same is true for Fire Force. If I show you this character, then most people will be able to tell you it's Maki. If I show you this character, most people will know it's Arthur. But what is it about the character designs in Fire Force that makes them so recognizable? Well, like in Soul Eater, one thing that makes these characters stand out are their shapes. In general, Ohkubo draws characters with a mix of long curves and round shapes, as well as sharp shapes and angles. And more often than not, it's usually pretty simple shapes. So you look at Shinra, right, and his design is pretty simple. He's got two half circles for eyes, he's got sharp teeth made with a bunch of triangles, and a basic haircut on top of a circular head. Now, something to note about Fire Force. In Soul Eater, something I noticed was that Ohkubo would do this thing where, say the characters are just chilling out or they're going through some exposition. Everyone would look especially simple and rounded out, and they'd almost look like chibis. But then when things got serious or there was a fight, the characters would be more stylized with sharper angles and shapes. This is something Ohkubo also does in Fire Force, but to a smaller scale. In my experience, it seems like Ohkubo does a lot more of the chibi characters in Fire Force. And even when it comes to the fights, the characters aren't nearly as stylized. Character designs in general are just a lot more consistent in Fire Force. Now, a few more notes about what makes these characters unique. One thing I noticed recently was that eyes are almost never closed. So Shinra has half circles, but the insides of his eyes aren't closed by the outlines. For Hibana, same thing. Even a character like Hinawa, who has very serious eyes, they're never really completely closed. The outline never makes a full circle. Doing so blends the eyes with the face, making the face have an overall flatter look. Speaking of which, Ohkubo really doesn't shade characters all that much in Fire Force. This is another big change, as in Soul Eater he did this fairly often. So in Fire Force there isn't a ton of shading, so again characters look simplified and somewhat flatter. But this isn't to say they look bad. If anything, I would say this just helps them look more stylized, because shading is just another way to add detail. The more detail you add, the more realistic they tend to look. But if you don't do that, then they retain that iconic look. One last thing I'll say about characters in Fire Force is that their overall designs are generally toned down, which kinda makes sense given the premise. They're all like military characters basically, so there would naturally be some uniformity to them. If anything, Ohkubo will give them some kind of interesting hairstyle, but that's kind of it. So like, you look at Company 8 and they're really not that crazy looking. If anything, it's more their quirks that make them stand out. So like the fact that Maki is bulky, or the fact that Hinawa wears funny hats. This is generally Ohkubo's approach in Fire Force. Even with characters like Benimaru, who besides his eyes really isn't that strange looking. There are plenty of crazy designs like all the Infernals, Joker. Burns is kind of a good blend because he wears the uniform, but he's also a beefy dude with an eye patch and crazy hair. So not as crazy looking as Soul Eater, but still tons of personality. But now that we've talked about some of the strengths of Fire Force, let's look at one of its weaker areas, namely paneling. Now, don't get me wrong, paneling in Fire Force is awesome. For example, when Shinra fights Sho and they have the Attila bursts and the paneling gets all messy to show how the Attila burst works, that's gold. And there's other examples like this where Ohkubo will do some weird stuff with the panels. But aside from that, paneling in Fire Force is just sorta good. It's never bad, but there isn't too much else I can say about it. In fights, it will look a bit more dynamic, but for the most part, paneling in Fire Force is fairly conventional. But speaking of fights, let's talk about how the art changes when Ohkubo draws fights. Something I've noticed in both Soul Eater and Fire Force is that big fights tend to be when Ohkubo makes his biggest changes, or does his most creative work. Like I said before, he generally draws in a more stylized way in fights. Part of this is because his focus shifts in these fights because he changes what he's emphasizing. So normally he puts a lot of detail in the scenery. In fights, he still makes detailed backgrounds, but what stands out more are the sense of action and the expression of the characters. For example, look at this panel from the Joker fight. Like I said, much more stylized than you typically see in Fire Force. Here, instead of a detailed background, we see Haha filling the page with a mess of slashes illustrating Joker's flurry of attacks. Joker himself has a thick, messy outline and a face that makes him look completely unhinged. You combine all that and you get a scene where you immediately get this feeling that Joker is unleashing all of this pent-up anger on this character. That is the level of expression and skill that Ohkubo puts into his fight scenes. And I could name a bunch of other examples, such as Arthur vs. Dragon, but I think you get the idea. So this, among other things, is what makes Fire Force look the way it does. But this isn't to say that the art style doesn't change over time. With most long-running manga, you can usually see at least 3 stages of the art. With Fire Force, because it's so consistent, there's really only like 2. I'd say the first one runs until about chapter 114, and then after that the art style never really sees any drastic or noticeable changes. And to be honest, there's really only like 2 differences. The first thing worth mentioning is that stage 2 is much more unhinged. Again, Fire Force doesn't have as many crazy panels as Soul Eater, and we don't really see them again until the later half. So I already showed you the panel from the Joker fight. But here's another example of what I'm talking about, when the characters go to the Chinese peninsula. It's not a change to the manga, as this was something Ohkubo was always capable of doing. He just does it more often in stage 2. The only other big difference is the characters. Characters seem to have a bit more detail in stage 1, so they have faces with a bit more structure that aren't just circles, and they actually have a bit of shading. In part 2, Ohkubo does a lot more of the chibi thing even in the more action-packed scenes. But that's really it. Like I said, Fire Force is probably one of, if not the most consistent manga I've ever read in terms of art style. It's got great looking characters, gorgeous fights, and backgrounds that have an impossible amount of detail. Some Soul Eater fans may argue that it's a downgrade, but I just think Ohkubo took a different approach in this manga. For spoiler reasons, I can't mention why, but it's pretty clear that he wanted this manga to look somewhat more realistic and not so cartoonish, and it makes total sense when you read the ending. And this is why Fire Force will always be one of the best looking manga in the industry. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you describe Fire Force's art style? How would you compare it to other manga? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my video on Soul Eater. In that video, I describe the artistic evolution of Soul Eater. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.